The purpose of the struggle against sin and weakness is not to win, because that is not possible. It is to get better at waging it. David Brooks. Oh, hey there. Welcome to the Retirement Answer Man Show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. And this show is dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement. It is to help you have the confidence to lean in and rock retirement. And here's the key. You're not going to figure this retirement thing out. There is not going to be the answer. To go to David Brooks' quote, you're not going to win it. You're not going to win having the best process and the right decision making, the best portfolio, etc. The purpose is the struggle, the intentionality to constantly work through all the decisions you have to make and do that on a consistent basis. That's the key. Well, it's probably the key to life, right? There are so many things, your marriage, your job, your friendships. You're never going to get it right. And that is okay. And that's one reason why we need to come at this process of retirement planning like a scientist. I love Dr. Bobby Du Bois' spirit as a scientist. We have to come at it with that spirit of curiosity. So when we make a bad spending decision or a bad portfolio decision, we don't bring out the hammer and bang ourselves in the head and call ourselves stupid. Why did I do that? We bring out the flashlight and observe, well, I wonder why I did that. What caused me to do that? How can I do that better next time? That sounds simplistic, but it's so powerful. And I lived with the hammer in both hands for most of my life, banging myself back and forth in stereo. And why couldn't I be perfect? Why did I screw that up? Why? Now I'm much more, okay, how do I do that better? How do we improve the process so we can make a decision a little bit better? That's what the ultimate game is for you and I when it comes to almost everything, but definitely retirement planning, that curiosity. So I like that thought for today. And we have some questions related to the bad markets and investment strategy. So we're going to answer those. And those will be, I think that's where we're going to keep our comments on the bear market and the worry that we have. I want you to ask questions and let's answer them on the show because we got the whole month of July here to do this. So you can go to rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger and leave a question and we'll answer it on the show, especially if it's market related or retirement related, obviously. And the fast pass is leaving an audio question. And then at the end of the show, before the Smart Sprint, we're going to have an interview that is a little bit different. And I'll tell you about it when we get to it, but it's going to be an interesting topic with some interesting perspective. How's that for a teaser? Let's get on with the show. Today's show is sponsored by LTCI Partners. They help people manage long-term care insurance needs. And long-term care is one of the big risks that you're going to face in retirement. And you want to face it head on in making a reasoned decision for how you're going to manage it or transfer this. And LTCI Partners can be a great partner for you to help you understand what policies are available to transfer this risk to. They're an independent agency, which means that they work with multiple insurance carriers and types of policies. So you can check them out at ltcipartners.com/RAM. All right, we're going to get into questions and answers. And we got some good ones today. And as a reminder, I think I just said this, but if you want to ask a question for the show, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger. So our first question comes from Jennifer. Jennifer says, hey, Roger, I'm 52 and have about $2 million in retirement accounts. I've been compulsively playing with the Fidelity Retirement Calculator. It says that I can retire comfortably at 55 if the market is average, and my money just barely will last until I'm 95 if the market is below average. But if the market is significantly below average, I'll run out of money in my 80s. My question is, what scenario should I believe? Obviously, it's better to be prepared for a bad market, but I'm thinking that because my time horizon is 40 years, any bear and bull markets are likely to cancel each other out over the long run, leading to average over the long run. Am I safe relying on the average or below average market estimates? Or do I need to keep working until I can survive a significantly below average market? Thanks so much, Jennifer. Oh, Jennifer, this is such a wonderful question. Oh, it really is. This is the key here. All right. First off, I think I shared this last week when Kevin and I were talking in Coach's Corner, and that is 99% is a beast. 100% is a lot easier. Certainty, whether it's a no or a yes, if it's certain and you know it's solid, that's actually a lot easier to deal with. When there's some room for possibility of something going awry, say 99% rather than 100, that 1% uncertainty makes it painful to manage because there's the possibility of the below average. So it doesn't matter if everything else is green light. You're going to fixate on that 1% possibility that life is going to blow up. 99% is a beast. And we can't get rid of that, by the way. The cost would be just too high. So let's talk about this and think through this, Jennifer. First of all, the fidelity calculator. So even with a Monte Carlo calculator, which is a calculator that runs different scenarios and randomizes returns, typically there will be an average, above average, or below average return assumption. Usually those assumptions, Jennifer, assume a linear rate of return, meaning that the exact same return every year. So as an example, if a balanced portfolio has a quote unquote average return of 8% and it runs that scenario, it'll assume that you're getting the average every other year. And then the below average scenario might be at 6% a year. And then the above average might be at 10% a year. So first off, I wouldn't believe any of those calculators, okay, from that perspective, because they're very deterministic because, like you said, we're looking at a 40-year timeline here that they're calculating these things. If it is a Monte Carlo analysis where it's randomizing returns up and down, I still wouldn't believe the calculator because we're forecasting into the future and we don't know which scenario is going to work out. So, the cool thing about Monte Carlo analysis where it says Jennifer and her spending plan, we're going to keep all of that the same and we're just going to randomize the returns and we'll run 1,000, say, simulations of Jennifer's life. And every simulation will be a different series of return experiences. And then we'll see what percentage of the time she was okay. That's how a Monte Carlo scenario will work, or run the numbers. And then you'll get, hey, you're 99% confident that this is going to work. Well, the problem is, Jennifer, is you don't get 1,000 scenarios. You only get one, and you don't know which one you're getting. And that's all that matters to you is that one. So I definitely wouldn't believe the calculators from that perspective. Another thing to consider here, Jennifer, is when you're doing very long-term planning, you're making so many assumptions about your spending habits, taxes, Social Security, and so forth that are not accurate. Doesn't matter how much time you spend analyzing how much you're going to spend when you're 75, you don't know what it's going to be. And trying to get more accuracy will not get you more precision. That's a simple statement, but it's a very profound statement that you should understand. Don't confuse accuracy for precision because we truly don't know what you're going to spend when you're 75 or what inflation will be or returns will be. And that's scary. And so everything I'm saying is like, well, this just sucks. What do I do? Here's what you do, Jennifer. This is why I believe in doing these long-term forecasts to help inform decision-making, but we don't want to make life decisions only with them. Because your life, I bet if you look back the last 40 years, it's changed in ways you never could have anticipated. And life going forward is going to be the same way. So I suggest if we cannot figure out the future over the next 40 years, in your case, mathematically with returns and spending and everything else, we need to make some reasonable assumptions, and then we need to come back to how do I manage through all of this uncertainty rather than trying to remove this uncertainty. And that is the ultimate game in retirement planning, is not trying to remove the uncertainty and figure out the future too far in advance, but what do I do now to walk this journey? And that is essentially what we talk about on this show and what we teach in the Rock Retirement Club is, what is the vision for Jennifer's life? Let's divide that vision between what we call the base great life. We used to call that needs. This is what Jennifer needs to have a great life, but without all the extras. And then what are the wants that Jennifer has that are more the flavor of life, that are the extras, the discretionary spending? And then what are the aspirational things that Jennifer wants? And we organize the retirement plan of record around those things to get to a feasible plan, not certain plan, a feasible plan that focuses on achieving the things that are most important to Jennifer today. And then once we have that, you want to make it resilient, not certain, but resilient. So as your life unfolds, whether it's you're changing your mind or life circumstances happen to you or the markets happen to you, that you have some resilience to absorb and make adjustments, and you have some optionality. And that is cash flow planning. That's the pie cake, etc. And you do all of that to make it a feasible, resilient plan using long-term calculations, but then coming back to the pie cake and planning it out on the near short term. And what this will do for you, Jennifer, is it will create slack in the system. So you have pieces to move around on the board. So when we get to Jennifer 2.0 next year, we can say, is this still what Jennifer wants to accomplish? Because that may change based on who you become over time. So we tweak what you want to accomplish. We tweak what your assets are. We tweak the feasible plan, and then we poke around for risks and opportunities that we should focus on to keep the plan on track down the future. And the reason you want to be agile in this, Jennifer, is that it may be we're below average for a period of time. And when we're below average and you're seeing that happen as you iterate on your plan, you can make little adjustments. You can move out some of the extraordinary things you want to spend money on or moderate them to help keep a plan feasible and resilient. And so essentially what happens, Jennifer, and I think this is the healthy part, is that since we acknowledge we can't figure out what's going to happen, we redirect our efforts to how do we improve our decision-making, where we follow a prudent process and then we repeat it in a continual cycle so we can have a great life regardless of what iteration we get. But the average returns, you're right. Nobody gets average. Everybody is going to get something different. We just don't know what it is. That's why it's more about managing uncertainty than trying to eliminate it. And that will, as a really beneficial byproduct, Jennifer, give you agency and confidence because you feel like, I have my hand on the wheel. I'm not going to let this get astray. So I have more confidence that I can go take that extra trip or change whatever it is in your life. So hopefully that gives you some context. Our next question punches it right in the middle of the target from Kevin on markets and valuations. And what do we do in an environment like this? So Kevin says, hey, Roger, I love the show. I just recently started listening. Welcome to the show. The only bad thing is your podcast is that there are so many older ones that I'm going to take a while to go through them. Kevin, I am always amazed that people like you go back and listen to the library of over 440 episodes. I'm amazed. So hopefully you'll find some nuggets there. It says, I'm hoping to retire early in about 5 years at 55, though admitted more from burnout rather than retiring to something. I'm sure I'll figure that out though. And I'm sure you will too, Kevin. Kevin has two broad questions. He says, first, since equities are considered relatively overvalued, I find it difficult to be too aggressive and bullish. However, bond yields are so low that those aren't great either. I'm not a huge fan of using alternatives. I know equities will help in the long run for growth and keep pace with inflation. And I do have a long horizon. And I understand that fixed income portion is more for safety. Assuming I build the right pie cake, should I worry about potentially poor investment returns, plus or minus 5 or 10 years around retirement? What are your thoughts on non-traditional investments or adjusting asset allocation? Or maybe I just answered the question myself and just accept the higher equity valuations if those funds won't be needed for a while, middle or lower pies. I have sufficient liquidity built up in my top cake. I'm assuming we eat our pies top down instead of bottom up. That's a good, I've always built it the other way, bottom up, but I get your point. This is the age-old question, Kevin, around decumulation. And, you make the statement, equities are considered relatively overvalued. And perhaps that's true. Some people would say they're extremely overvalued. Others would say they're very undervalued. I don't know. And I think you did answer the question yourself. If your time frame is 10, 20 years, it doesn't really matter because it's not just simply what the valuation is. We think of, say, an equity valuation. We think that for valuations to get better, that prices have to come down. But a lot of other things can happen too, right? Earnings could go up. And there are other levers around the valuation metrics rather than just simply stocks coming down. And so that makes this problematic. And the other part is that we don't know when that state might recorrect, right? Back in 2009, even coming out of the Great Recession, people said they were overvalued and they churned higher and higher and higher for 20 years or 10 years, I guess. And the flip side of this too, Kevin, right? If they're undervalued, they could churn lower, right? Generally, things overcorrect one direction or the other. And sometimes those cycles can take much longer than we would expect. And that does make this really problematic. And how do we approach this? You hit another point on fixed income in terms of the safety aspect of it. So the value of fixed income is primarily that you receive the yield and they are safe, meaning that you get your money back, which provides some stability to a portfolio. With the advent of bond funds, where there's never actually a maturity, you don't actually get your money back over time, right? Because the bond fund is an infinite thing. It just continually regenerates the portfolio. So if we are in a state of rising interest rates, bond funds, the value of them will go down relative to the rise in interest rates. And then over time, as that portfolio regenerates, it will start throwing off more income because it's buying bonds at higher coupon rates. And those things will work out in the long run as well. And so for very long-term portfolios, Kevin, what I end up doing is using funds, whether they're index or otherwise, for these very long-term things. Because even the bond portfolio, as it goes down, will regenerate itself and continue to reinvest dividends or interest in this case. And the yields on those will rise over time. And if I have a 10, 15-year time horizon, I don't want to try to predict any of that. But when you get to nearer term, 10 years less, 5 years less, you're essentially going to get impacted by inflation on the near term, but that's acceptable risk because you want the return of your money back, right? This liquidity bucket that you're talking about. And so for that, I would use individual securities. T-bills actually don't look that bad today. You could do a 1 or 2, 3 year T-bill ladder, which will mature and start to bring, as interest rates go up, your yields will go up. So from a portfolio construction standpoint, Kevin, to your question on asset allocation and altering it, and this is essentially what the pie cake does, is it's more of what's called a barbell, which is rather than have one allocation that has a mix of everything and a lot of in-between or intermediate investments, you take your assets and you have two extremes with not a lot in the middle. So a barbell, just like a barbell in a gym, right? So on one end, you're going to have the liquidity that you talk about, Kevin. That's going to be super safe, meaning that you're going to get the return of your money and it'll take on some inflation risk, but you'll get some yield, but you know you're going to get your money back and you need that to fund your lifestyle. And you don't have a lot in betweens. And then your other end of your spectrum, your investments are going to be fairly aggressive. Maybe it's 70, 80, 90% equities diversified. So there's not a lot in between. And you ultimately end up getting to roughly a balanced portfolio, but the way that you account for it is very different. So you have a lot of liquidity and safe. I want the return of my money. And then you have a lot of, I want return on my money that's going to be very volatile. And those are helping manage inflation risk on the long term and sequence of return risk on the short term. Now you talk about, what about alternatives, non-traditional investments? Well, that's a big junk drawer of stuff, isn't it? We have to define our terms when we say non-traditional investments. There are hedge funds, there are private equity funds, there is buying commercial real estate properties directly or as a limited partner, there's buying single-family homes individually and managing income properties. All of these do have a potential place in the allocation, Kevin. I have a number of clients that own a lot of commercial real estate as limited partners. I have clients that own a big portfolio of individual homes where they receive income from it. And there are advantages to those in terms of the income thrown off, the inflation hedge of having real assets that could grow over time from an inflation standpoint, but they come with a cost, right? There's more. If you're doing it directly, say a single family home, well, you got the management of it. The AC breaks, you got to fix that. You got to find tenants, you got to collect rents and all of that. So there's going to be some friction there that you're going to have to do yourself, or you're going to have to pay someone, say in that case, a property management firm to do for you. You might have some policy risk. I know people that have, say, individual rental houses in Oregon. They're worried about the policy risk of how landlords are treated relative to tenants. And so now they're divesting from there and moving to other places because they're worried about that. So it introduces some other things. And in the case of, say, being a limited partner in a real estate deal like a storage center or a hospital or something like that, you're betting on the execution of the general partner to actually make it work. And when you get into them, you can't get out of them. There has to be some liquidity event. And so you're counting on someone else to navigate all of that. And they're much more illiquid, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Illiquid assets are more patient money, so it makes it easier for the general partner to manage those things. And we might be talking above some people's heads here, and we can explain some basics of this stuff maybe in another episode. But I guess the key point here, Kevin, yes, alternatives are not necessarily a bad thing, but they're going to introduce other risks that you want to make sure you're aware of that you incorporate it in. And the primary one is going to be execution risk of either you or whomever you're turning the money over is going to have to execute this. Now, when we get into hedge funds and private equity funds, we have a lot of the same types of things. So in the securities industry, those are the alternative investments, and it's the execution risk. A good example is a portfolio I'm aware of that has an amazing 20 plus year track record. It's a long short fund. So they're going to go long companies they like and short companies they think will fall. And it has an amazing record that with the same management team for decades, they did extremely well in 2008. They just experienced their largest drawdown, roughly 50% peak to trough, that they've ever had. So it's not doing what it's supposed to do right now. It's supposed to zig when the markets zag, and they're both zagging together. And so you have that execution risk. So I'm not opposed to that, but I think you just want to think through it and decide that you want to go on that journey, and then what portion do you want to go on that journey? All right, second question, two-parter for Kevin. My second question is around bonds. I know you like bond ladders, but there is greater risk with corporates. What are your thoughts about using laddered ETF or bond ETFs like iShare bonds or Invesco bullet shares? It seems like these would help mitigate the single issue risk, yet still have a targeted maturity date so you can anticipate when you're going to get your maturity back. What do you think of those relative to individual bonds? For Treasury, there's probably no need, but they have also munis, corporates, and high yield. So Kevin, I'm actually not opposed to those. And so what Kevin is referring to are there's these newer products that have a portfolio of bonds, and they all roughly mature on the same date. So let's say you buy a 2-year corporate ETF that will pay back to its shareholders and go away on December 1st of 2024. So rather than having to find an individual corporate bond, you can buy a portfolio bond of ETFs, and then it matures at a certain date. I've been experimenting with those, Kevin, and they work fine. I think they're not necessarily a bad thing. And you mentioned Treasury T-bills. I think those are actually, at the moment, relatively attractive relative to corporates CDs and money markets, especially in the 1 to 2 year range. And those are just bonds that mature and they give you your money back. It's, I think, the most liquid market in the world. So hopefully, Kevin, this answers your question and gets you on your way. So our next question is actually a comment from Toby. And Toby is taking me to the principal's office for my language. Toby, I appreciate it. Nicole usually catches these, by the way. And I don't know if she's mentioned this one. And so really, she's the one that should catch this. But I talk a lot, right? I talk every week with you on the show. And I don't script anything. I'm just reading the questions. I'll maybe have a little bit of outlines from some of the technical stuff, but I want to talk through how to think about something. And I have a propensity to misuse or pronounce words, as Toby pointed out. And Toby, it's okay. You said, sorry for being that guy. I appreciate it. I embrace it. This is roughly who I am, and I try to improve. My wife actually still to this day gets impressed because sometimes I've mixed up exacerbate with exacerbate. Wait, now I'm messing myself up. What is it? Exacerbate, exasperate. You get it. So I'm working on it. I'm a work in progress, Toby. So Toby says, Roger always says flesh out, like flesh out an idea, when he should say flesh out. Sorry for being that guy. Toby, I didn't even realize that. I always thought it was flesh out, not flesh out. I'll have to look that up and I will do better in the future. Thanks for pointing it out. All right, let's get to our next question. Hey, Roger. Love the podcast. This is Brian. Howdy, Brian. I just retired at age 54. Didn't wait until 55 so I could take a larger lump sum payment. Do you have resources or have you ever done a show about early retirement tools like 72T? I'm going to do a 72T, but it makes me nervous. If you search online, every article is watch out for this, watch out for that. Yeah, Brian, you bring up a good point. So congratulations on your retirement. Sorry, it took a little bit to get to this question, so sorry about that. So Brian retired at 54 and he wants to access money from his pre-tax account, an IRA or the 401k. And if you access money prior to age 59 and a half, as Brian knows, take money out of an IRA prior to 59 and a half, you will have a 10% penalty because it's meant to be over 59 and a half. And so what Brian's referring to when he talks about a 72T, and that refers to the IRS code 72T with a bunch of other parentheses behind it. This is what's called substantially equal periodic payments from an IRA or 401k. And if you follow the rules of a 72T code, you can take out payments from an IRA or a 401k prior to 59 and a half and not pay that 10% penalty. And it is very confusing. So I'm going to direct you to a web calculator, such as the one that's on Fidelity's website. It's fidelity.com/calculator-tools. You basically have to search for 72T Fidelity Calculator, and I think you'll find it. I have the link so I can get this to Nicole, and we'll put this in our 6 Shot Saturday email, which gives me a good segue to make sure you know what that is, because I'm always told I forget to mention it. So we have a weekly email that we send out to listeners where I share a summary of the show and links to things that we might mention in the show, so you don't have to go search for them. We'll share the link to this Fidelity calculator. And also I'll share some things that I'm reading or things that I have found useful. And the cool thing is, 1, you get that in Saturday morning, so you can read it with your coffee. And 2, if you hit reply, it actually comes directly to me. So from time to time, we can have a conversation via email anyway. Can't promise anything, but I try to reply to as many as I can. So you can sign up for that at 6shotsaturday.com or rogerwhitney.com. I think it's down at the bottom. So we'll put that link in the email. And one thing, Brian, be careful when you use the calculator because many of them that have not updated to current interest rate environment, which would increase the amount that you could take out in a substantially equal payment from March 22 on. So if the calculator isn't updated, it's probably giving you a lower number that you could take out than the one that you're seeing. So if you're actually going to do this, you want to make sure you're using the current interest rate assumptions that the IRS is publishing so you can get the correct amount in executing your 72T. So hopefully they'll help you out. And for those that you aren't aware, if you grab that link, there'll be an explanation, no doubt, on that site. So we can just cover that there too. All right, let's get on to another question. Our next question is an audio question from our good friend, Dan Miller from 48 Days to the Work You Love. Great podcast, by the way. Let's check out Dan's question.
Hey, Roger. Man, I appreciate your information. It's so helpful week after week. This is Dan. Got a question about my life insurance. I've always carried term life insurance specifically for the purpose of taking care of the mortgage for my wife should anything happen to me. Well, I originally had, $1 million coverage, and then I reduced that to $500,000 a few years ago. But I recently had my 75th birthday. We're in a good position with no mortgage on our beautiful house and other resources. I've got 4 years left on the original term insurance that I had purchased. But in looking at it, that's another $20,000 over the next 4 years. Now, I'm in really good health. And again, having removed the mortgage, it kind of begs a question for the reason that I originally had the life insurance. Would you suggest I keep that in place, or that I go ahead and take what would be another $20,000 in premiums during that period of time to invest in a more productive way? Thanks, man.
Well, that's a really good question, Dan. And first off, I want to make a note. And I know Dan, he's a friend of mine. I'm honored to call him a friend. He just turned 75. Did you hear the energy, the life in his voice? I hang out with him a couple times a year. He lives in Florida now. And he's like that all day long. That man has so much energy. And his wife, Joanne, is exactly the same way. I always tell him that. He is my rabbit. I want to be Dan. I want the energy and the excitement of Dan when I'm 75. So keep it going, Dan. So this is a great question. And so the issue before the house is you have $500,000 term life insurance. That's the death benefit if you were to pass. So if you pass, the insurance would pay out $500,000. And you have 4 years left on this term policy. So that means at the end of 4 years, they're going to increase the rate to, well, at that time, you'll be 79. And the premium sounds like it's $5,000 a year. So do you keep the policy? And if you pass in the next 4 years, someone will be paid out $500,000. Or do you take that $5,000 a year in premium, surrender the premium, and redirect that $5,000 towards something else, whether it's investment, enjoyment? We can go down the 5 things of what you can do with money, right? And those are, by the way, pay down debt, save it as cash, give it away, invest it, or spend it. The key here will be, if we knew you're going to die in the next 4 years, the insurance is awesome leverage, right? You know that $20,000, spend 20 or less to get 500. That's a good deal. But at the end of 4 years, that $20,000 would be gone. A couple things you want to consider here, Dan. One is, if you don't have the insurance and you were to die, will your wife, Joanne, be impaired financially in any way? Will that impact her life not having that $500,000 payment? Question 1. Question 2 would be, if you were to pass in the next 4 years and she wouldn't be impaired, would that $500,000 allow her to do something a lot easier? Perhaps it would be give to kids, give to charity, cover estate taxes. Would it be kerosene to help her do something that she might have some difficulty doing otherwise? You mentioned another consideration is your health, and you are a relatively healthy guy, actually very healthy guy, but things happen, life happens. So you want to evaluate that. And then another consideration, I think, Dan, would be that $5,000 you spend every year. Is that hurting your cash flow materially in any way? Is that a big burden? Or is that a payment you could easily make given your cash flow and your net worth? Or is it causing you to miss out on creating more experiences with your grandchildren or with Joanne or what have you? Sort of like the question we had from Jen, I think it was last week, on the taxes from a Roth 401k. If it's not that much of a burden, knowing what I know, and I know you more than most people, I would probably just keep it. If it's not impacting you materially cash flow wise, I would just keep the insurance, let it run out, and then cancel it at the end of 4 years. But I think those are the considerations that you want to think about. Because that $20,000 invested in, whether it's your business, somewhere else, yeah, that's going to be money that you have and it will grow ultimately to something. It's just that window of 4 years with a leverage of 20 grand versus 500,000 payout. That's a pretty asymmetrical payout. So I probably would keep it. Our next question is really some feedback in relation to last month's series on legacy. And this is from Mike. Mike says, "Hey, Roger and team, thanks so much for the valuable, thought-provoking information you provide." And he says, "I was reading Six Shots Saturday and was inspired to rethink how to leave behind my life stories. My dad passed away several years back, and recently mom passed. Looking at their old pictures, I have seen these over the years, and I don't know the stories behind them. So I'm going to pull out my favorite life pictures and write up the stories behind the pictures. I will create a book and give copies to our children. I am so excited to share the idea with you. Blessings, Mike." Oh, I like that, Mike. You're right, the pictures. And I think he's referring to, I shared a photo of my grandfather when he was in World War II, and I didn't know him at that point, but I don't have any context other than his written notebook, which we shared a photo of as well, of all those missions. But the story behind a photo is the color that brings everything to life. What was I thinking then? What was I feeling? What happened right before that? I love that idea, Mike. For you, it sounds like you're going to create a book and you're going to write these stories, which I think is great. When I think of myself from a creative standpoint, and I just want to throw this out there as an idea for perhaps for others, is I have often thought from time to time, wow, this podcast, although it's retirement focused, we talk about a lot of important life stuff. And I talk a lot about what's going on in my life and my mindset, and my errors and everything else. And I'm like, my podcast is an audio record of my life over the last 8 years. I've done it when I'm sick. I've done it when I'm happy. I've done it when I'm sad. And so another example of this, Mike, for someone else perhaps would be, and I like this idea too, especially in the digital age, and if you don't like writing, is to have a photo in your hand and just video yourself and create these little videos of you talking about the photo. And that way, when you're telling the story about, yeah, this is the photo of right after I met your mom, or right after I lost the race, and share some colors to what I was thinking right before, during, and after, and maybe a lesson or two. And then you have a series of these with the photo. That's another great idea. Mike, I love it. Thank you so much for sharing. Another project, but you're thinking, and I love it. It truly would be a treasure. So good job. With that, we're going to move on to an interview that we're going to have. So let's move over there and I'll set this up for you a little bit. So in a minute, I'm going to share an interview with AMY Bloom, who is an American writer and psychotherapist. We're going to talk about her journey with her husband. And she wrote a book on this recently called In Love, a memoir of love and loss. And we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And the reason we're chatting with Amy is because of a meetup that we had in the Rock Retirement Club, where we were talking about, I think we were launching our long-term care decision pod, which is an organized way of thinking through managing long-term care, which is something we launched for the club. And a member, during the open discussion about aging and Alzheimer's, etc., asked a very challenging question about how do you manage the end of life? And does it make sense to always extend life, or does it make sense to proactively extinguish your life? Came out of left field for most people. We hadn't had that discussion. And there are a lot of religious, philosophical things tied up in that question. And it could be a non-productive discussion if we don't have open minds and think critically. And to the credit of the culture of the club, we ended up having a 15-minute or so discussion around this topic. And the philosophical question and the logistical question of actually planning to extinguish your life if it gets to that point. A lot of people jokingly, and I've had this with clients, I'll just I got that Colt 45 in the bedroom. I'll take myself out back. That's good bravado, but it's not a plan. And so we got into that discussion. So I was researching this topic because it's something to at least chat about. Didn't mean to do it. And I came across Amy's book, In Love, a memoir of love and loss, where she shares the journey of her and her husband when her husband was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I believe. And his choice of choosing to extinguish his life. And it chronicles the journey of how they actually did it, or how he actually did it. And so I wanted to share that perspective just to expand our thoughts on how we plan. This is called always poking around and being creative. Doesn't mean we do or agree with everything, but it's a healthy discussion. So let's go have a chat with Amy. The first thing I thought of, Amy, as we were getting ready to chat was, why share this story? I know you're an accomplished writer, so you have the competence to share this story, and your writing is beautiful and very straightforward, which I appreciate. But outside of having the competence to share the story, why did you share it?
Well, I shared the story mostly because Brian, my husband who passed away from Alzheimer's, asked me to. And he asked me to because he knew I was a writer, and also because he felt that it was really important to tell the story. He felt not just his story, but he felt that this was such a hard topic for people to talk about, the end of life and sort of what kinds of rights people should and do have at the end of their life, and how that process goes, and talking within the family and making plans and dealing with the medical profession. He felt that all of these things were really difficult for people. And he wanted me to tell our story and really his story. And otherwise, I wouldn't have done it because I'm not a memoirist and I don't actually particularly enjoy writing about myself.
And so it sounds like Brian had the same initial thought of, Amy is competent. She can tell this story. And so some of this was honoring his wish.
Oh, it was almost entirely honoring his wish. After he died, I went back over my notes, and when I had about 90 pages, I thought, I think this actually could be a book. I could do what Brian wanted. And then when I finished it, I sent it to my editor, who was like, yes, we would like to publish this book. And then we went on from there.
One thing I like about the book and how you told it, and I'm guessing it comes from the spirit of you're not that public of a person memoir-like, is that rather than have the aperture wide and tell this full story of your entire life with Brian, the aperture was pretty tight on alternating between the journey that you had and making the decision and the actual event and working towards that, which I think was wise. I like that approach because it focuses on the central issue that Brian was, I think it sounds like you're saying he wants to know, hey, this is hard to navigate and we need to realize these kind of choices. So it was for you and it was for Brian. So let's talk a little bit about that journey if you're okay with that.
Sure.
Okay. I'm guessing you've talked about it, you've written about it, but for me, I feel weird even asking about it, to be honest with you.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate the delicacy, and some people more delicate than others, but I also feel like I am all right talking about it. And I think that it can be helpful to people to talk about it. So I'm sort of prepared.
Okay, good. You and Brian, your life was going along. It sounds like you had a rich life. When was this topic first even thought of?
Well, I think that there's probably a difference between when it occurred to me that there was a problem and when it occurred to Brian that there was a problem. So for me, I noticed several years ago, like in 2016, that just some things were changing in his behavior. And as is the case for most people who are married, you're never entirely sure if the person's in a bad mood or they're getting a cold or they're just feeling a little midlife depression or what it is. But he was clearly becoming more irritable. He was not a particularly irritable guy, and also struggling. He had he was an architect and he had taken a new job. And it was clear when he was coming home, and they had hired him with great enthusiasm because he was a really good architect and a really charming guy. But he would come home and he would clearly be out of sorts. And I would say, what's going on? And he would say, well, the design part is going okay, but I'm having a lot of trouble with the printer in the office. And the first couple of times I was like, oh, did you ask so-and-so, the admin in the office, to help you if there was a problem? And then he began to say things like, well, she was kind of short with me. She said that she had showed me before. And then it sort of became clear to me that, in fact, she had showed him 6 or 7 times and in the middle of a busy office was not prepared to keep doing this task for which people did their own work. And then there were some issues about the design. He was a wonderful designer, but it was also clear to me that he was not quite hearing what he was being told to do and that he was working really slowly. So all of those things, he began to be very testy about his schedule and then began to carry a paper calendar from around, like the way my grandma used to carry her handbag from room to room. And that was also really puzzling because I understood he didn't particularly like keeping his calendar on his phone. He wasn't a big phone guy. But this became global so that if I said to him Wednesday at 4:00, I'm going to be done with work at 5. Do you want to go to the 7:00 at the movie theater, which is 5 minutes from our house? He'd be like, let me check the calendar. And I would be like, what are you checking the calendar for? And that was a big change. So there were some signals like that.
So little compensations to that he was doing probably organically.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. It's no different than having a bad hip and learning to walk a little differently, but you do notice the difference.
And how old was Brian when this started?
Oh, I would think when it really started, he was probably about 64.
Okay. And so this is a progressive journey, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And when did you first discuss this idea that it's not about longevity and there's actually other options? Was that before all of this? Was that just a philosophical belief that there were open conversations, or did this start that process?
I think Brian had always felt that the purpose of life was joy and purpose, and longevity was great, but quality of life mattered even more. And his mother, who is now 88, famously used to say, we're not here for a long time, we're here for a good time.
I like that phrase.
I do too.
I'm not here for a long time, I'm here for a good time. And I have a number of relationships in my career and in the club where people will say in casual conversation, oh yeah, I'm not going to do that journey. I'll go out back and, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of us have that feeling, and we say that when we're not faced with it. So how did this become more of, this is philosophically, we're here for a good time, not a long time, to no, really, we're here for a good time, not a long time?
Well, the prospect of your mortality is, really concentrates the mind, as Samuel Johnson said about hanging. And so this was not abstract for us. Brian was diagnosed as having Alzheimer's. We came home from the neurologist's appointment. We spent a very quiet, very sad weekend. And basically at the end of the weekend, he said, you know me, I am not doing long goodbye. We have seen it up close in our family.
Okay.
It is a terrible disease. It destroys the person who has it and destroys their family. And I am not doing this. And I said, you don't have to make that decision. I will take care of you. I will look after you. I will protect you. We will be in this together for as long as possible. And he said, you're not listening to me. I am not doing this. And as I write in the book, one of his guiding principles was, if there's going to be a fight, throw the first punch. And I think that's very much how he felt about Alzheimer's as well. I mean, he could see some of the losses. He couldn't see the losses as clearly as people around him. And he understood that he was only going to have a limited amount of time. The window is not endless during which you can make up
decisions.
Your mind about what you're going to do. And so when people have this fantasy of like, oh, I'll just go into the backyard and end it all, I want to say, well, you better make sure that you have the cognitive functioning to arrange that, and that you have the physical well-being to arrange that, and also exactly how are you going to do that? And if you haven't thought about exactly how you're going to do that, you're not being serious.
And you remember that you had decided to do that, bluntly.
That's what I mean about the cognitive function.
Right. But in my understanding, you correct me if I'm wrong, there's that low resolution. It's not like a binary test, blood test for Alzheimer's, right? It's not yes or no. It's interpretation in between whether someone has it or not, and also the progression and how quickly or how slowly. And I think that's correct, and because I'm not a doctor, but how did you incorporate that into, or how did he incorporate that into his thinking, or did you challenge that?
Well, let me clarify that a little bit. It is absolutely true that there is no test when you are alive to see if you have Alzheimer's. Right. And so what the best neurologist in the world will say to you is, it seems very, very likely that you have a dementing disease. We think probably Alzheimer's. When you have an MRI, you look at the MRI and you can see the blooming white spaces where they should not be. And you can see the size of the brain. It's not touchy-feely. It's not like, oh, it seems like somebody has
thank
Alzheimer's.
You.
There's a mental status exam, which is very simple, which can be given by a competent high school student. And the results are extremely clear.
Okay.
So when Brian receives the diagnosis, very, very likely, and has the MRI, we understand. And we understand that he's probably had the symptoms of Alzheimer's for several years. And we understand that his body might not give out for another 10 or 15 years, but his mind will give out long before then.
Mm-hmm.
And that is incontrovertible. There is no plateau of Alzheimer's. It is a downward progression. It is a decline. And it is a decline from the period at which your symptoms first show up, which is often several years, sometimes even 5 years.
It's those little things that you talked about that just are,
right.
Yeah.
Right. And then it will continue. And one of the reasons that Brian made the decision that he did is that nobody could say to him, you have 3 or 4 good years left. Don't think about ending your life. Do it in a few years. I mean, people would say that, but they would say that based on having recently Googled Alzheimer's.
Yes. Trying to be helpful, but if you're not a participant in the journey, it's a different viewpoint. When you're inside the bottle, it's totally different.
I think the way to be helpful, if one wishes to be helpful, is to say to the caregiver and the person with the illness, I am available. Here are some things that I could do. Would you like me to drop off a casserole Wednesday at 5:00? That's helpful. Your opinion based on your Google MDing and your own personal wish for the reality to be something else, not so much.
Yeah, it's essentially projecting your sadness and sympathy rather than being helpful. And that's natural. That's a human trait, right? And I have a friend whose wife has early onset Alzheimer's in her 50s. And I've seen this total change in his life and obviously hers, right? It's not just her. It's his entire,
no.
Yeah. Okay, so he throws the first punch.
Mm-hmm.
How do you engage in this, I'm sure, devastating idea for you, loving this man?
Well, yeah. And I did offer him that we could proceed in a different manner, that he could live with Alzheimer's and we would go through that process. As I say, we had now seen this for 3 different people, 2 guys that he played football with and a woman who was his mother's best friend and really an aunt to him. So it's not like we didn't know what it looked like.
And that's an important perspective, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to know what it is like, go spend some time with a family in which it is happening. And it really clarifies things tremendously. And then he sort of said to me, which was characteristic with or without Alzheimer's, he was like, honey, go research this. You're so good at that. Let me know. Let me know what we should do. And I was like, okay, I will do my best. And quickly discounted the right to die states, 10 of them in the United States, because for somebody with dementia, they are 100% useless.
Let's talk about that because people think about that. Oh, I can go to whatever the state is.
They do. I know they do. I know people are like, I'll just go to Vermont. I'll just go to Oregon. To which the answer is, well, so you're going to become a resident of Oregon or Vermont. You're going to have 2 doctors attest that you have absolutely no more than 6 months to live as a result of your terminal illness. You're then going to have 2 interviews, and good luck finding those doctors, and then a written essay about your wish to end your life. And then there will be a 2-week waiting period in most of those states while they deliberate, keeping in mind the fact that you have 6 months to live. And then you will go to the pharmacy. And if you have passed all these standards, receive a lethal dosage, which you will take at home. And a physician can help you with a straw to take it. None of this has anything to do with dementia because you have to be cognitively intact in order to proceed. And if you have only 6 months to live and you have Alzheimer's, you have left that standard in the dust many years ago.
Years ago. And that is important, I think, because this is what we're thinking about when we think about having this right and this control over our body.
Right. The laws are clearly designed, because the language in them is almost always identical, is clearly designed not to relieve as much suffering as possible, but to make sure that as few people as possible can take advantage of the law. And they've been very successful. The number of people who have been able to utilize these laws in all of those states is tiny.
And nobody wants the liability.
Yeah, nobody wants anything to do with any of it.
No.
And I don't blame them, but it is not a way for a country like ours to pay attention to the needs of its citizens.
So you discovered that, and I'm sure that took a while. So there was option A, not going to be able to happen. And you share, and I didn't realize it, that the place that you discovered is like the only place in the world where you can do this. So I guess talk to me once you realize that option A was not an option. how did you navigate, I guess, legally, but also just logistically the process? And you share some of the interviews in the book and things like that, but I just like to hear your narrative.
Well, legally isn't an issue because Dignitas, which is a nonprofit organization located in Zurich, whose only function basically is to offer accompanied suicide to people who meet their criteria. And the first criteria is cognitive discernment. And they get all sorts of applications. I mean, they have had people come with oxygen tanks. They have people come with their entire extended family. I remember there was a scientist from Australia who was 94 years old, and he went. And what he said is, I've had a great life. I can't really see anymore. I'm very hard of hearing. My mobility has disappeared in the last 2 years. I have had a wonderful life. I would like it to end now. And again, we in this country have absolutely no provision of that.
None.
The quality of your life is of no interest to anybody in either the policymaking or the medical profession. It is only keeping death at bay, as far as I can tell. So, obviously there are lots of exceptions among a lot of wonderful medical professionals, yes. But the stance is that death is the enemy, not the quality of life is the goal. So Dignitas, you can become a member, which just means you send them $300 and you are supportive of their efforts because they have a lot of volunteer help. And then if you wish to pursue what they would describe as an accompanied suicide, you make an application, which is a biography, which is medical records, and a couple of interviews over the phone. And then if you all goes well, you get a provisional green light. You go to Zurich and you have 2 more interviews with physicians. And if those go well, then you have an appointment and you go to a very clean, very quiet apartment in the outskirts of Zurich. And we were met by really lovely, tactful, kind, very committed people who were volunteers. And that's where Brian ended his life. And it was painless and it was peaceful and it was legal.
Now, I noticed that it occurred in January, February of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian was still cognitively capable.
Absolutely.
As part of this process. Had it been March or April of 2020 and you had to wait the whole COVID season and he wasn't capable, was this still an option?
No, not at all. I mean, they are very clear that the thing that they require is discernment and capacity. And so it doesn't matter. It's not like, for example, in the Netherlands, where if you are a Dutch citizen, you can say, I have early onset Alzheimer's. I am in full possession of my faculty. When I reach X point, I would like to end my life. And in the Netherlands, that is taken seriously, and you can arrange for your physician if they are willing to help you end your life several years later. Not only do we have nothing like that, but also in Switzerland, that is not their position. Their position is you can only do this while you have the judgment, because they will ask you multiple times, and I mean multiple times, are you sure? Is this what you want to do? What is your understanding of what will happen? If you should change your mind at any point, we will be 100% supportive of that. Please don't hesitate to change your mind. So you can see that sort of discernment.
What a blessing of the timing, because you was right at the edge of not possibly ever having the option.
I think if he had gotten a date from Dignitas 3 weeks later, it would not have been possible. Airports were already closing as I was on my way home.
Oh, my Lord. So you bring up a key point for people that are listening that are thinking about themselves in the future, right? I'm a big believer of we want to make decisions. It's a community of us, right? Our today self, but also we want to set ourselves up for our tomorrow self, whether that's at age 70 or age 80. So right now, it sounds like if I wanted to pre-plan, and this was one reason why I reached out to you, Amy, was we had a discussion about this where someone I believe right around 50 brought up this kind of planning. Hey, we're doing our estate planning documents and this is our choice. How do we actually do this in a pre-planning stage? It sounds like this may not even be an option if I don't have the cognitive ability. Doesn't matter what's in the document. They're not going to do it currently.
I believe that is the case. And you can have a committed family. You can have a plan that says DNR, and also do not intubate, and no feeding tube. And you may find yourself in a medical facility where people are respectful of that. And you may find yourself in a medical facility where people are very concerned that they will be sued for not pursuing all ways of keeping you alive, and they will not be respectful of that. I had a family member who was in a nursing home and with Alzheimer's, and certainly nearing, I would say, probably the end of her life. And we got a call from the nursing home that they were going to put a feeding tube into her stomach. And I said, why? They were like, to keep her alive. And I was like, I don't understand the meaning of that. And really what they meant is, we don't have the staff to sit here and spoon feed this lady pudding 3 times a day, for which she will, in a somewhat automatic way, open her mouth and swallow. We don't have the time. So we're going to put in a feeding tube, which is a very unpleasant thing. And we'll keep her alive for a few more weeks, but you won't be able to say we starved her to death.
And that is the institutional logistical facts on the ground.
Yeah.
Right or wrong?
I don't find myself thinking right or wrong, but I take your point.
Well, my point is always, we're not going to change them today. So realizing the facts on the ground, I just have to navigate, right? So that's the world I live in. I agree with you. It's more than, it doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it can't be changed. But today when I got to make a decision, and that's part of advocacy, I would imagine, right?
Absolutely. And it's also part of people being willing to have difficult conversations and say to each other, I mean, I have a friend who's 87, and he said to me, I could never do what Brian did. I think that if I'm in a decline, I want to be taken care of. I trust my wife to take care of me, and I would not do anything else. And I thought, well, then that is your decision. And absolutely, you are entitled to that. Do let your wife know. But
yes, do let her know.
I understand.
And I wanted to get to the reaction of family, because people hold on. And a lot of this, this do not resuscitate and things like that. When you have a healthcare power of attorney, you're appointing somebody else to make decisions for you. Sometimes their grief, their emotion, there isn't logic involved. They don't want to lose a loved one, and that can influence how they make decisions. So
absolutely.
If there was, you probably took the brunt of it, it's Brian, and from friends and family and so forth. How were the reaction of others? Were they understanding?
Some people were. Some people, I'm sure, were not and kept it to themselves, for which I am grateful. Some people were not and shared it with me. That wasn't awesome. But the important people, which were his mother, who was a very religious lady, she's a devout Catholic. And when we told her about his decision, I'd gone down to talk to her early in the morning. She was staying at our house, and I wanted to have that conversation with her before Brian was up, because if it went badly, I didn't want him to have to experience that. And she took my hands in hers and she cried and she said, I prayed about this all night and I am so relieved. Having gone through this with my best friend, I did not want this for my boy. It is a terrible, terrible end to a life. And she was a terrific supporter. She got everybody in the family on board on his side of the family. My kids were very supportive. And, of course, there were friends, some old friend wrote to him and said, literally, I Googled this. I don't think Alzheimer's is that bad. And you probably have several good years. And my uncle had Alzheimer's. And
the cure is coming.
Yes. And we were at a family party and he seemed to be having a great time. And happily, I wasn't the person who had to respond to that email. And Brian wrote back, after sort of expostulating to me, he, basically saying, it's my life. I don't understand why people think they're entitled to have an opinion about this. But he wrote back to his friend and said, Dear so-and-so, thanks for writing. I appreciate your feelings. We are available for support and love only.
That was like the elegant way, whereas the reaction way, and which is the visceral way of back off, dude, with a lot of other words around that, right?
Yes. My response was not as elegant and not as generous, but that's why it's great to take 5 minutes before you send your email.
One thread that I've noticed, Amy, in you in just the 20 so minutes that we've chatted, that you've articulated with Brian, is there's a sense of conviction that this is our life and there are boundaries between what we decide for us and what anybody else thinks.
I would say that is how we felt about it, is how I felt about it, is about how Brian felt about his life long before I knew him. So a very determined, basically fearless, and straight ahead guy. We used to say he's a hard man to stop.
Okay, after he passes and you honor him in writing this book and having to talk about it with random people like me to hundreds of thousands of people, what reflection or wisdom have you observed for yourself in your journey?
Well, I think two pieces to it. One is better to be prepared, better to think about it when you can think about it than to think about it when you're in a crisis. Better to talk about it with your family. And it's not that I'm unsympathetic at all. My parents had a small house. I had to chase them around that tiny house just to get them to sign a living will. I'd go into the kitchen. My father's having a cup of coffee. He'd look at me, he'd get up. He was like in his undershirt and boxers, and he'd like walk out to the backyard. I'd go out to the backyard. He'd be like, I'll be with you in a minute, honey. And then he'd go garden. And I'd go inside. I go, Ma, can we talk about this? She was like, absolutely. I'll just go get your father. And then the two of them would go out to the garden. So I understand it is a hard conversation to have. So that was part of it. It is worth having not just a conversation within the couple, but a conversation within the family. The other thing is that I think you have to really sort of seek joy because there's so much darkness. Part of our responsibility, I think, to ourselves as well as to our partners and our family is to be able to notice the flowers, is to see the crocuses coming up through the snow, is to say the things that you have wanted to say. And I don't feel that, mortality is bearing down upon me, but I do feel that it is the best thing I can do is to really focus on the things that really matter to me and to be less interested and less attached to the things that don't really matter to me. I do really find that even at Brian's memorial, I was really, and there were a lot of people and it was lovely. I didn't spend any energy on people who didn't come or people who handled it poorly or people who said things to me or to him that were deeply distressing. I just decided, I'm going to forgive everybody. Mm-hmm. And that has worked for me.
So I've had the honor of having conversations one-on-one with, I don't know how many people that are in their 50s and 60s thinking about, the word is retirement. I don't even like the word. This is the show's the retirement answer man. I don't even like the word. But this time of life where there's freedom from all the work obligations, not necessarily the absence of work. And one thing I've observed, Amy, and I think it hits to this idea of punching first, and there's this tension with people, almost to a person, of they want to live as fully as they can today, but they're so worried about, will they be okay at 80? Will they be okay at 90 from a financial standpoint? And generally, the people that have the most options are the ones that are most afraid to be about being okay financially later in life, that they just naturally delay their life.
Yeah.
That's hard to navigate. And I think some of it is the tension never goes away, but living with the idea that something like this could happen to anybody at any time and trying to live like it's the last day, right?
I appreciate that people I'm very big on planning. I'm actually quite cautious financially, but you're not going to be okay at 90. I mean, you may have your money. How okay are you going to be? You're going to be 90. You're not going to be dancing mostly. Some people will be, but there will be problems. There will be obstacles. There will be losses. There will be diminishment. You're going to be 90. That's how that's going to be. So if you have been thinking, I really would like to see Marbella one more time, and you don't go, my own experience is that it's not necessarily just will I have enough money when I'm 95, if I live to be 95? But I think there's also some anxiety and hesitance that people feel about embracing their own wishes. Surely that's not allowed. Surely
there's a lot of that.
There will be a price to pay. Surely that it is better to not make any big gestures, not make any big plans, and try to scrounge along in the corners of the room and not be seen by God and struck down. And I think there is a lot of that. It's not just the money.
Or I'll do it later.
Yes, I had a conversation with a friend of mine whose husband is 87. And I said, oh my gosh, there's this gorgeous river cruise, and I know how much you love Portugal. And she said, we're going to go when he's older. And I thought, are you? Good luck.
Memento mori. I want to end with the phrase that, was it your mother or his mother said?
His mother. We're not here for a long time. We're here for a good time.
Amy Bloom, In Love, a memoir of love and loss. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks so much for having me.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to have a little baby step that you can take in the next 7 days to not just rock retirement, but rock life. So in the next 7 days, now that you're fresh off of your digital sabbatical, if you did last week's SMART Sprint, I'm going to challenge you over the next 7 days, now that you've had this digital detox, is to reassess your relationship with the internet and news. Maybe you do this by journaling how you felt over the last 7 days. Maybe 7 days wasn't enough. I don't know. Did you notice anything about how much more present you were with individuals or how much better you slept? You could do this journal. You could just think about it. But over the next 7 days, ponder what that 7-day sabbatical was like. It may not have been enough as I think about it. And then just glean some wisdom there. All right, I am off to Columbus, Ohio. Actually, by the time you hear this, I will be back. But I'm excited for a little trip in the heat of the summer. It's hot there, but not as hot here in Texas. I hope wherever you are, that you are rocking your life. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance reference is historical and does not guarantee future results. All indices are unmanaged and cannot be invested in directly. Make sure you consult your legal, tax, or financial advisor before making any decisions.